Sometimes the people we underestimate the most turn out to be exactly who we need. In the mountain town of Pine Hollow, folks spent years mocking Elias Ward, the quiet man who lived alone in the hills and rarely spoke a word. They figured he was just a lonely hermit with nothing to offer. The town had its own hunters and trappers, men who talked big about their skills. But when a massive grizzly started killing livestock and threatening families, those same men couldn't stop it. Fear spread through the valley. The mayor called for the best trapper they had. What happened next stunned everyone. How did the man they'd laughed at prove he understood these mountains better than anyone? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 1882, and Pine Hollow sat nestled in a valley where the Montana Territory stretched wide and wild. It was the kind of town that grew up around promise, timber from the forests, minerals from the mountains, and fertile land in the bottomlands where the creek ran clear and cold. Main Street ran straight as a rifle barrel, lined with false-fronted buildings that tried their best to look important. The mercantile, the saloon, the land office, and the church with its white steeple reaching toward heaven like a prayer. About 200 souls called Pine Hollow home, give or take a dozen depending on the season. They were practical people, mostly, ranchers and loggers, shopkeepers and their families. They knew hard work, knew the value of a handshake, and they knew their place in the careful hierarchy that governed small towns. The mayor's opinion mattered. The banker's word carried weight, and the men who could hunt, trap, and protect the community from the dangers of the wilderness, well, they walked with a certain pride that others respected. Elias Ward didn't fit anywhere in that hierarchy. He'd shown up in Pine Hollow 7 years back, arriving on a cold November morning with nothing but a pack on his shoulders, a bedroll tied tight, and a hand-carved walking stick that looked like it had traveled 1,000 miles. The stick was something to see, weathered oak, smooth from years of handling, with intricate carvings running its length, animals mostly, a wolf mid-howl, an eagle with wings spread, a bear standing on its hind legs, each one carved with such detail you could almost see them breathe. Folks noticed the stick before they noticed the man carrying it. Elias was 42 years old, though his face carried more years than that. Weather had carved lines around his eyes and mouth, and his beard, kept neat and trimmed, showed streaks of grey threading through the brown. He stood average height, but there was something solid about him, like an old tree that had weathered too many storms to be moved by wind. His eyes were what people remembered, pale blue, quiet, and so deep you felt like he could see straight through to whatever you were trying to hide. He bought a small parcel of land in the high country, 5 miles up the mountain trail, where the pine trees grew thick and the air turned thin. Built himself a cabin there with his own hands, squared logs, tight joints, a stone chimney that drew clean. He came to town once a month for supplies, paid in cash, and spoke only when necessary. A nod of greeting, a quiet thank you to the shopkeeper. Nothing more. The townspeople didn't know what to make of him. Hermit, they called him at first. Then odd. Then, as the years passed and he remained a mystery, useless. Why live so far from everyone else? Why keep to himself? What was a man good for if he didn't contribute to the community? Didn't join the other men for a drink at the saloon? Didn't come to church on Sundays? Buck Hendricks made it his personal mission to mock Elias whenever the opportunity presented itself. Buck was Pine Hollow's most respected hunter, a big man with broad shoulders, a booming voice, and an opinion on everything. He'd grown up in these mountains, knew every trail and creek, and he made sure everyone knew it. His father had been a trapper before him, and Buck carried that legacy like a badge. He had a crew of 3 men who followed him around, laughing at his jokes and nodding at his wisdom. "There goes the ghost," Buck would say when Elias walked past, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Living up there all alone, probably talking to the trees. Maybe he thinks he's a bear himself." His crew would laugh. Others would smile, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge Buck's judgment. Elias never responded. He'd simply continue on his way, walking stick, tapping a steady rhythm on the wooden boardwalk, his expression unchanged. Mayor Samuel Garrett watched these interactions with growing unease. Samuel was 56, a fair man who'd been elected twice because people trusted his judgment. He'd built his mercantile from nothing, raised a daughter on his own after his wife passed, and he tried his best to lead the town with wisdom rather than ego. He didn't like how folks treated Elias, but he also didn't see a reason to intervene. The man seemed content with his solitude, and Samuel had learned long ago that you couldn't force people to accept what they didn't understand. His daughter Sarah saw things differently. At 24, Sarah Garrett had her father's sense of fairness and her late mother's compassionate heart. She worked in the mercantile, managing the books and helping customers, and she'd noticed things about Elias that others missed. The way he examined the goods before purchasing. Careful, thoughtful, never wasteful. The questions he asked about tools and supplies, revealing knowledge about wilderness survival that went far beyond what most men possessed. The quiet respect he showed everyone, even those who mocked him. "He's not what people think," she'd told her father once. "Maybe not," Samuel had replied. "But a man who doesn't explain himself can't complain when others misunderstand." Sarah disagreed, but held her tongue. She made a point of treating Elias with the same courtesy she showed everyone else. When he came to the store, she greeted him by name, asked if he'd found everything he needed, and wished him well when he left. He always nodded his thanks, and once, just once, she'd seen something flicker in those blue eyes. Gratitude, perhaps, or recognition that at least one person saw him as human. The truth was, Elias Ward possessed more skill in his quiet fingers than most men in Pine Hollow would acquire in a lifetime. He knew the mountains the way a master knows his craft. Every sound, every track, every shift in the weather. He could read sign that others couldn't see, the broken twig that told him a deer had passed 3 hours ago, the scat that revealed a mountain lion's territory, the scratch marks on a tree that showed him where a bear had marked its range. He knew which plants healed wounds and which ones killed. He knew how to move through the forest without sound, how to find water in drought, how to survive winters that would kill a lesser man. He'd learned it all from his grandfather, a legendary trapper who'd worked these mountains back in the 1840s when the fur trade still thrived. The old man had taught young Elias everything, not just the technical skills, but the philosophy behind them. Respect the land, understand the animals, take only what you need. Move through the wilderness as a guest, not a conqueror. The walking stick had been his grandfather's, passed down when the old man died. Each carving represented a lesson learned, an animal understood, a piece of wisdom earned through years in the wild. Elias had come to Pine Hollow, seeking peace after loss. 7 years ago, fever had taken his wife and young daughter in the span of 2 weeks. The grief had nearly destroyed him. He'd walked away from his previous life, a respected position as a guide and tracker in Wyoming, and sought the solitude of these mountains where memories couldn't follow quite so closely. He'd never intended to hide his skills, but he'd also never intended to prove himself to people who'd already decided he wasn't worth knowing. So he lived his life quietly, watching the town from a distance, helping when he could in ways they'd never notice. He'd diverted a small avalanche path away from the logging road. He'd tracked and relocated a problem wolf pack before they got close enough to threaten livestock. He'd left anonymous warnings about thin ice on the creek where children played. The town never knew, never asked, never wondered if the quiet man on the mountain might be the very person they needed most. That was about to change. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in late September, when Tom Johnson came riding into town like the devil himself was chasing him. Tom was a steady man, not given to panic or exaggeration. He owned a ranch 3 miles east of town, ran 50 head of cattle, and had a reputation for being as reliable as sunrise. So when he galloped down Main Street, shouting for the mayor, people stopped what they were doing and listened. "Something got into my herd last night," Tom said, his face pale beneath his hat. "Killed 3 of my best cattle. Didn't eat much of them. Just killed them and left them there." Samuel Garrett came out of the mercantile, Sarah right behind him. A small crowd gathered quickly, the way crowds do when trouble announces itself. "What do you mean, killed them?" Samuel asked. "Torn apart," Tom said, and his voice shook slightly. "Throat ripped out on one. The other 2? He stopped, swallowed hard. "I've seen bear kills before, Mayor. This was a bear, but nothing like I've ever seen. The tracks are massive. This thing is enormous." Buck Hendricks pushed through the crowd, his crew trailing behind him. "A bear?" He made it sound almost exciting. "Hell, Tom, we get bears up here all the time. Probably just a big male passing through." "This one's not passing through," Tom said firmly. "It dragged one of my steers 100 yards, a full-grown steer, and the way it killed them, it was angry, Buck, or desperate. Something's wrong with this animal." Samuel frowned. "You're sure it's not wolves?" "I know wolves, Mayor. This was a grizzly, a big one." The crowd murmured. Grizzlies weren't uncommon in the Montana Territory, but they usually kept their distance from settled areas. They had enough wilderness to roam without needing to bother livestock. A bear that came this close to town, killing cattle it didn't even eat. That suggested something had gone wrong in the natural order of things. "I'll handle it," Buck announced, his voice carrying across the gathering. "Me and the boys will head out this afternoon, track that bear down, and put an end to this before it becomes a real problem." People nodded, reassured. Buck was their hunter. This was what he did. Elias stood at the edge of the crowd, near the corner of the general store where he'd been loading supplies onto his pack horse. He'd heard every word. His eyes had gone distant, thoughtful, the way they did when he was reading sign that others couldn't see. Sarah noticed him there. "Mr. Ward?" she said quietly. "What do you think?" A few people turned to look, surprised that she'd addressed him. Elias met her gaze for a moment, then looked back toward the mountains. "A bear that kills without eating is either sick, injured, or old," he said, his voice soft but clear. "Probably can't hunt its normal prey anymore. It'll keep coming back to easier targets." "There, see?" Buck said loudly. "Even the hermit agrees it's a problem. Don't worry, folks. We'll take care of it." Elias said nothing more. He finished loading his supplies, mounted his horse, and rode out of town without another word. Buck's hunting party left that afternoon, 4 men on horseback, well armed and confident. They returned 2 days later with nothing to show for their efforts except stories about difficult terrain and tracks that led into rocky country where horses couldn't follow. "We'll get it next time," Buck assured everyone at the saloon that evening. "That bear's smart, but it can't hide forever." 3 days later, the bear struck again. This time it was the Miller homestead, 4 miles north of town. The family woke to the sound of their dog barking frantically, then yelping in pain, then silence. When Jacob Miller rushed outside with his rifle, he found their livestock pen torn open and their dog dead, its neck broken. The bear had killed 2 sheep and wounded a third before vanishing back into the darkness. Jacob's children had nightmares for a week afterward. Other families started keeping their kids inside after dusk. The town meeting that evening filled the saloon to capacity. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, faces grim. Women clustered near the back, worry etched in every expression. Samuel Garrett stood on a chair so everyone could see him. "We need to address this before someone gets hurt," he said. "Buck, where are we with tracking this animal?" Buck stood, his confidence slightly dented, but still present. "It's moving through rough country, Mayor. But we've got its pattern now. We'll set up in the right spot, and we'll get it." "When?" someone called out. "Soon," Buck replied. "These things take time. You can't rush a hunt like this." "My children are afraid to go outside," Jacob Miller said, his voice tight. "How much time do we have?" Samuel raised his hands for calm. "Buck and his men are doing everything they can. In the meantime, everyone needs to secure their livestock at night. Keep your animals close to the house and stay alert." It wasn't enough, and everyone knew it. Elias had attended the meeting, standing quietly in the back corner where shadows gathered. He listened to Buck's explanations, watched the fear spreading through the community, and said nothing. When the meeting ended, he slipped out before anyone could notice. But Sarah noticed. She followed him outside. "You know where that bear is, don't you?" she said. Elias paused, his hand on his horse's reins. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, "I know where it's been. Where it's going is harder to say. Why don't you tell them?" "They haven't asked." "My father would listen." Elias looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression softened. "Your father has to balance a lot of concerns, Miss Garrett. Politics, pride, community confidence. Sometimes the truth complicates things more than it helps. But people are frightened. They are. And maybe they need to be, for a little while. Maybe they need to understand what happens when you assume competence without earning it." Sarah frowned. "You're talking about Buck." "I'm talking about all of them. This town decided a long time ago that they knew everything they needed to know. About these mountains. About themselves. About me." He swung up into his saddle. "Sometimes it takes a crisis to realize how little we actually understand." He rode off before she could respond, leaving her standing in the darkening street with questions she couldn't answer. The third attack came 5 days later, and this time it wasn't just livestock. Widow Peterson lived on the southern edge of town, her small house and chicken coop backing up against the tree line. She was 72 years old, stubborn as iron, and refused to be intimidated by anything, including a rogue bear. She kept a shotgun by her door and figured that was protection enough. The bear came just before dawn. It tore through her chicken coop like paper, killed 6 birds, and was working on the gate to her goat pen when Widow Peterson fired both barrels of her shotgun from her back porch. The blast echoed through the valley like thunder. The bear roared, a sound so deep and furious that people heard it 1/2 mile away, and charged the porch. Widow Peterson barely made it back inside, slamming the door as the bear hit it with enough force to crack the frame. It clawed at the wood, roaring again, and only retreated when several neighbors arrived with rifles and started shooting into the air. When Buck and his crew examined the scene an hour later, they found tracks that made even Buck go quiet. The paw prints were enormous, 14 inches long, 8 inches wide. The claw marks on the door went deep into the solid oak. And most troubling of all, there was blood in the tracks. The bear was injured, leaving a trail of drops every few steps. "It's hurt," one of Buck's men said, stating the obvious. "Which makes it more dangerous," Buck replied. "A wounded bear is unpredictable." Samuel stood nearby, his face grave. The attack had happened less than 200 yards from Main Street. The bear was no longer just threatening outlying homesteads. It was at their doorstep. "We need to end this, Buck," Samuel said quietly. "Today. Whatever it takes." Buck nodded, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "We'll get it, Mayor. I swear we will." But as he said it, he glanced toward the mountains, toward the high country where Elias Ward lived in his solitary cabin, and for just a moment doubt showed clear on his face. The bear had come to Pine Hollow, and everyone was beginning to realize that talking big about hunting skills was very different from actually possessing them. Elias stood silent in the back of the church for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only 10 seconds. Every eye in Pine Hollow focused on him, waiting for an answer that would either save them or confirm what many had believed all along, that he was just a hermit with nothing real to offer. "I'll help," he said finally. "But not the way you're thinking." "What do you mean?" Samuel asked. "I mean, I won't join Buck's hunting parties or follow his strategies. I work alone, in my own way, on my own timeline." Buck made a sound of disgust. "This is ridiculous. Mayor, you're going to put the town's safety in the hands of someone who won't even coordinate with the rest of us?" "I'm putting it in the hands of someone who might actually succeed," Samuel replied, and the words hung in the air like a verdict. He turned back to Elias. "What do you need?" "Nothing. Just time and space. Keep your hunting parties out of the western slopes for the next week. Let me work without interference." "A week?" someone called out. "What if it attacks again?" "It won't," Elias said with quiet certainty. "Not if you follow some basic precautions. Bring all livestock in at dusk. Keep dogs inside at night. Don't leave food or waste out where it can attract the bear. It's avoiding humans now after the shooting at the Randall place. It's injured, probably more cautious. That gives us time." "How do you know it's injured?" Buck demanded. "Because Frank Randall said he shot it, and I found blood in the tracks near his property this morning." Several people exchanged glances. Elias had been tracking the bear while they'd been having their emergency meeting. Sarah spoke up from her seat. "What happens after a week, Mr. Ward?" Elias met her eyes. "Either the problem is solved, or I'll admit I was wrong and step aside." It wasn't a guarantee, but it was more honesty than Buck had offered with all his confident promises. Samuel made his decision. "All right. 1 week. Buck, I need you and your men to focus on protecting the town itself. Patrols keeping watch at night. Let Mr. Ward handle the tracking." Buck's face went through several shades of red before he managed to speak. "You're making a mistake, Mayor." "Maybe," Samuel said. "But it's my mistake to make." The meeting ended shortly after, people filing out into the night with mixed expressions of hope and skepticism. Elias left first, as he always did, but this time Samuel followed him out into the street. "Mr. Ward," the mayor called. "A moment, please." Elias stopped, waiting as Samuel approached. "I need to know something," Samuel said quietly. "Can you really handle this bear, or are you just trying to prove a point?" "Both," Elias answered honestly. "I've been tracking it for 2 weeks. I know its territory, its patterns, its condition. I know where it dens and where it hunts. I could have caught it days ago." Samuel's eyes widened. "Then why didn't you?" "Because your town needed to understand something first. Needed to learn that skill isn't about who talks the loudest or who's been here the longest. It's about genuine knowledge, earned through years of patient work." Elias paused. "And maybe I needed to see if anyone here would ever think to actually ask for my help, instead of assuming I had nothing to offer. That's a dangerous game to play with, people's lives." "I kept watch," Elias said. "Made sure the bear stayed away from the most vulnerable areas, diverted it when I could. But I couldn't stop it entirely without catching it, and I wasn't ready to do that yet." Samuel absorbed this, his expression troubled but understanding. "My daughter was right about you. She said you weren't what people thought. Your daughter is wiser than most. She gets that from her mother." Samuel extended his hand. "Do what you need to do, Mr. Ward. We'll stay out of your way." Elias shook his hand, the first time he'd done so with anyone in Pine Hollow in 7 years, and then mounted his horse and rode off toward the mountains. Sarah had waited by the mercantile, watching the exchange between her father and Elias. When her father returned, she fell into step beside him. "You did the right thing," she said. "I hope so. Buck is furious. Half the town thinks I'm a fool. The other half thinks you're finally showing some backbone." She smiled slightly. "I'm in that half." Samuel sighed. "Buck's a good man, but pride makes us all stupid sometimes. He'll come around." "Will he?" "He'll have to. If Elias succeeds, Buck will have no choice but to acknowledge that maybe he doesn't know everything about these mountains after all." They walked in silence for a moment before Sarah asked the question that had been bothering her. "Father, why do you think Mr. Ward lives the way he does? So isolated, so separate from everyone." "I don't know," Samuel admitted, "but people don't choose that kind of solitude without reason, usually painful reasons." In his cabin 5 miles up the mountain, Elias sat at his rough-hewn table with his leather journal open before him. The journal was more than just a record. It was a legacy. His grandfather had kept similar journals, dozens of them, all filled with observations about animal behavior, tracking techniques, survival skills. When the old man died, he'd left them all to Elias, along with the walking stick, and a single piece of advice: "Knowledge unused is knowledge wasted. Pass it on or let it die with you." Elias had never found anyone to pass it on to. The world had changed. Younger men weren't interested in the old ways, in patient observation and hard-earned wisdom. They wanted quick solutions, modern methods, faster results. But tonight, writing in his journal by lamplight, he wondered if maybe Pine Hollow was finally ready to learn. Not all of them, perhaps. Not Buck and his pride. But some. Sarah, her father. Maybe even Martin Shaw, who'd recognized the name Ghost Walker. He sketched the bear's territory in detail, marking the den location, the likely paths, the places where sign was heaviest. Then he began planning the trap. Not a simple snare or a clumsy cage, but something designed specifically for this bear, taking into account its age, its injury, its learned caution. It would take 3 days to build, another day to set and bait properly, then waiting, which was the hardest part for most men, but came naturally to Elias after 7 years of solitary patience. The next morning, he began gathering materials: pine logs, strong and straight, rope woven from hemp, the kind that wouldn't fray under pressure, iron hinges he'd carried up from town months ago for a different project. Everything had to be perfect, because there would be only one chance. He worked methodically, measuring twice and cutting once, each movement economical and precise. By evening of the first day, the frame was complete. By evening of the second day, the mechanism was installed, a trigger system so sensitive that even a cautious bear would activate it, but so carefully balanced that nothing smaller would set it off accidentally. On the third day, he added the final touches, a sliding door that would fall once triggered, gaps small enough to contain, but large enough to allow air, reinforced corners that could withstand 800 pounds of angry grizzly trying to break free. It was a masterpiece of practical engineering, and it sat in a clearing 3 miles from his cabin, positioned exactly where the bear would pass on its way to the lower valleys. On the fourth day, he baited it, not with fresh meat, which the bear would suspect, not with livestock kills, which would smell of human interference. Instead, he used a deer carcass he'd found in the forest, a natural death, already several days old, exactly the kind of easy food source a desperate bear would seek. Then he settled in to wait, hidden upwind in a blind he'd constructed weeks ago, and watched the trap with the patience of a man who understood that nature moved at its own pace, not at the convenience of human schedules. Buck's patrols continued in town, increasingly frustrated that they had nothing to do. Martin Shaw, to his credit, stayed out of Elias's way, but the Jeffries brothers grew impatient and returned to Copper Creek, and Buck's remaining crew spent most of their time at the saloon complaining about being sidelined. 5 days passed. On the 6th day, just before dawn, the bear came. Elias saw it emerge from the tree line like a shadow given substance, massive, moving with the careful deliberation of an animal in pain. Even from his position, 50 yards away, he could see the bear favoring its left front paw, could see the grey in its muzzle that marked its age, could see the fresh wound across its shoulder where Frank Randall's bullet had grazed it. The bear stopped at the edge of the clearing, testing the air, its massive head swinging back and forth as it searched for danger. Minutes passed. Elias remained absolutely still, breathing slowly, trusting the wind direction and his chosen position. Finally, the bear moved forward, drawn by the smell of the deer carcass. It approached the trap cautiously, circling once, twice, before hunger and desperation overcame caution. It reached through the opening for the meat. Zuor, trigger released. The door fell with a solid thunk, and the bear exploded into action, roaring, throwing itself against the walls, testing every corner for weakness. The trap held. Every joint, every brace, every carefully measured angle did exactly what Elias had designed it to do. After 5 minutes, the bear stopped struggling and sat back on its haunches, panting, watching the forest with dark eyes that held intelligence and something like resignation. Elias remained in his blind for another hour, watching to make sure the trap truly held, watching to make sure no damage had occurred that might allow escape. The bear had settled down, conserving energy the way old animals learned to do. Only then did Elias emerge from his hiding place. He didn't approach the trap directly. Instead, he circled wide, letting the bear see him, letting it understand that he was there and that he meant no immediate harm. The bear watched him, alert but strangely calm. "You've had a hard time of it, old one," Elias said softly. "I can see that. You didn't ask to get old, didn't ask for that paw to go bad. You just did what you had to do to survive." The bear huffed once, a sound that wasn't quite a growl. Elias studied the animal for a long time, seeing not a monster or a threat, but a creature at the end of its strength, forced into conflict with humans not through malice, but through the simple, brutal mathematics of survival. "They want you dead," he continued, still speaking in that soft, steady voice. "Can't blame them for that. You've hurt them, scared them. but I wonder if there's another way. He turned and began the long walk back to his cabin, leaving the bear contained but alive, leaving himself time to think about what came next. In Pine Hollow, the 7th day arrived with growing tension. Elias had said 1 week, and the week was almost up. There had been no attacks, which gave people hope, but there had also been no word from Elias, which gave them doubt. Buck used the silence to rebuild some of his damaged reputation. He's failed, Buck told anyone who would listen. Probably chased the bear deeper into the mountains, and now he's too proud to admit he couldn't catch it. But Samuel Garrett held his tongue and his nerve, trusting in something he couldn't quite name. Perhaps Sarah's judgment, perhaps his own intuition, perhaps just the quiet certainty he'd seen in Elias's eyes that night at the church. Sarah went about her work at the mercantile, serving customers and managing inventory, but her mind kept drifting to the mountains. She'd brought supplies to Elias's cabin twice over the years, authorized by her father when the hermit couldn't make it to town during harsh winters. She'd seen how he lived, the neat organization, the careful maintenance of his few possessions, the books on his shelves about natural history and wildlife behavior. She'd seen the carving, tools, and the half-finished pieces of wood that would become beautiful representations of animals. She'd seen the journals stacked carefully on a high shelf, away from moisture and mice. She'd seen evidence of a life lived with intention and purpose, even if that purpose wasn't understood by others. "He'll come through," she told her father that evening. "I don't know how I know, but I do." "I hope you're right," Samuel replied, "because if he doesn't, I'll have lost the town's confidence, along with whatever credibility he might have had." The next morning, just after dawn, Elias rode into town, leading a second horse loaded with supplies. He went directly to the mayor's office and knocked on the door. Samuel answered, still in his nightshirt, surprised to see the mountain man standing on his porch. "I've caught the bear," Elias said, without preamble. "It's 3 miles up in the high country, contained in a trap I built. It's alive and unharmed." Samuel stared at him, processing this information. "You caught it?" "When?" "Yesterday morning. I've been watching it since, making sure the trap holds, making sure it has water and doesn't injure itself trying to escape." "Why didn't you kill it?" "Because that's a decision for the town to make, not me. You have the right to choose how this ends." Samuel pulled on his boots and his coat. "I need to see this. Bring others if you want. Bring Buck. Bring anyone who needs to see it to believe it." Within an hour, a group of 20 had assembled. Samuel, Sarah, Buck, and 2 of his crew, Martin Shaw, several ranchers, and assorted townspeople who'd heard the news and wanted to witness the resolution of their fears. They followed Elias up the mountain trail, a journey that took 2 hours on horseback and another 30 minutes on foot into terrain where horses couldn't easily go. Some grumbled about the distance, but Elias set a steady pace and didn't respond to complaints. When they reached the clearing and saw the trap with the massive grizzly contained inside, every voice fell silent. The bear was even larger than they'd imagined. 800 pounds of muscle and power, its dark fur silvered with age, its eyes watching the approaching humans with wary intelligence. The trap that held it was a work of craftsmanship. Every log fitted perfectly, every angle calculated for maximum strength. Buck Hendricks stared at it for a long moment, his face cycling through several emotions before settling on something like grudging respect mixed with residual anger. "How did you do this?" he asked finally. "Patience," Elias replied. "Understanding. Respect for what I was dealing with." He looked at Buck directly. "I didn't try to force the bear to come to me. I learned its patterns, understood its needs, and positioned myself where it would naturally go." Then I waited. For 6 days. For as long as it took. Samuel approached the trap carefully, studying the bear, seeing the injured paw, the grey muzzle, the bullet wound across its shoulder. "It's old," he observed. 25 years, maybe more," Elias confirmed. "That injured paw probably happened years ago. Healed wrong. Never worked right since. It can't hunt normal prey anymore. Livestock was survival, not choice." "So what do we do with it now?" Someone asked the question everyone was thinking. The question hung in the mountain air, heavy with implications. 20 people stood in that clearing, staring at the trapped grizzly, and 20 different opinions formed in 20 different minds about what justice looked like. "Kill it," Buck said immediately. "It's hurt people, killed livestock. It's a danger. We end this now." Several people nodded agreement. The bear had terrorized their valley for weeks, after all. It had nearly killed Frank Randall. Children had been afraid to play outside. But Sarah spoke up, surprising herself with her own boldness. It was only trying to survive. "So are we," Buck countered. "And we have families to protect." "If we kill every predator that threatens us, where does it stop?" Sarah persisted. This bear didn't choose to get old, didn't choose to be injured. It just did what it had to do. "That's a luxury of thinking we can't afford," one of the ranchers said, not unkindly. "Miss Garrett, I respect your compassion, but that animal is dangerous." Elias had been standing apart from the group, letting them work through the debate themselves. Now he stepped forward, his voice cutting through the rising argument. "There's another option," he said. Everyone turned to look at him. "The wilderness extends 200 miles north of here," Elias continued. "Deep forest, high valleys, rivers full of salmon. A bear like this could live out its remaining years there, far from any settlement. It would never threaten humans again." "And who's going to transport an 800-pound grizzly 200 miles?" Buck asked skeptically. "I will," Elias said simply. "Build a travois. Move it slow and careful. It would take 5, maybe 6 days. But it's possible." Samuel frowned, thinking through the implications. "That's dangerous work, Mr. Ward. One mistake, and you'd be killed." "I've handled dangerous work before." "Why would you even want to?" Buck demanded. "You've caught it, proved your point. Just shoot it, and be done." Elias looked at the bear, and something in his expression made several people uncomfortable. Not because it was frightening, but because it was deeply, painfully human. "Because some things deserve a second chance," he said quietly. "Because just because we can end a life doesn't mean we should. Because maybe there's wisdom in choosing mercy when we have the power to destroy." The words settled over the group like snow, soft but unavoidable. Martin Shaw, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. "I'll go with him. I'm old, but I can still handle a rifle and help with the heavy work." "And me," Sarah said immediately. "Absolutely not," Samuel said, his father's authority, breaking through his mayor's diplomacy. "That's too dangerous." "Father, I'm 24 years old. I can make my own decisions." "Not about getting killed by a bear, you can't." Elias held up a hand. "Miss Garrett, I appreciate the offer, but your father's right. This isn't work for—" He stopped himself, reconsidering his words. "This isn't about capability. It's about risk. If something goes wrong, I need people who can handle themselves in a wilderness emergency." Sarah started to protest, but Samuel touched her arm. "Let him work, sweetheart. There are other ways to help." Buck had been listening to all this with growing frustration, his face reddening. Finally, he exploded. "This is insane. We're seriously discussing a week-long expedition to save the life of an animal that's terrorized this valley. No, Elias said calmly. We're discussing whether we're the kind of people who only know how to destroy, or whether we have the wisdom to choose differently when we can. That's not wisdom, that's foolishness. Maybe, Elias acknowledged. Or maybe it's the difference between surviving and living well, between being strong and being wise. He turned to Samuel. Mayor, this is your decision. Your town, your people. I've given you an option. You can choose it or not. Samuel looked at the bear, then at the faces around him. Some angry, some thoughtful, some confused. He looked at his daughter, whose eyes pleaded with him to choose mercy. He looked at Buck, whose jaw was set in stubborn certainty. He looked at Martin Shaw, who nodded slightly, giving permission to the harder choice. How many men would you need? Samuel asked Elias. 3, maybe 4. Men who can handle themselves in the wilderness, who won't panic if things get difficult. I'll go, Martin said again. I will too, Samuel said, and before anyone could protest, he held up his hand. I'm the mayor. I approved this plan. I should see it through. Besides, I was a trapper myself before I bought the mercantile. I remember how it's done. Buck stared at his mare with something like betrayal in his eyes. You're actually going to do this? I'm going to try, Samuel replied. Buck, I need you to stay here. Keep the town safe while we're gone. You and your men patrol. Watch for any other threats. Can you do that? It was a face-saving offer, a way to give Buck purpose and responsibility. The hunter struggled with his pride for a moment before nodding stiffly. Thank you, Samuel said. Then he looked at the 2 ranchers who'd come with them. Tom, Jacob, I'd like one of you to volunteer for this. Tom Johnson, whose cattle had been the first victims, studied the bear for a long time. I'll go, he said finally. That thing killed my livestock, hurt my livelihood. But I've seen what desperation looks like, and he gestured toward the bear's injured paw. Maybe Mr. Ward's right. Maybe we can be better than just settling scores. Elias nodded his appreciation. 4 men, then. We'll need supplies, horses, equipment, 2 days to prepare properly. Whatever you need, Samuel said. Sarah, you'll handle that? Of course, she said, though her disappointment at being excluded from the journey itself was evident. The group began the trek back down the mountain, but Elias lingered, standing near the trap and studying the bear. Sarah noticed and held back as well, waiting until the others were out of earshot. Why are you really doing this? She asked. And don't give me the noble answer about second chances. There's something else. Elias was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, 7 years ago, I had a family. A wife, a daughter just about 5 years old. Fever took them both in less than 2 weeks. Sarah's hand went to her mouth. When my daughter got sick, she was scared, Elias continued, his voice steady but weighted with old grief. She kept asking if she was going to die. I told her no, told her everything would be fine. But it wasn't. And in those last days, when she was suffering, when the fever was burning her up from the inside. He stopped, swallowed. I would have given anything for mercy, for an end to her pain that wasn't just death. I'm so sorry, Sarah whispered. That bear is old and hurt, and at the end of its strength, Elias said. It doesn't deserve to die in fear, in a cage, just because it tried to survive. If I can give it a few more years of peace, away from conflict, away from pain. He looked at her. That's a kind of mercy I couldn't give my daughter, but I can give it to this creature. Sarah felt tears on her cheeks. The town never knew. About your family, about any of it. The town never asked, Elias said simply. They saw a hermit, decided I was worthless, and never looked deeper. People do that. They make judgments based on nothing and then defend those judgments like they're gospel truth. I asked my father once why you lived the way you do. What did he say? That people don't choose that kind of solitude without painful reasons. Elias smiled slightly. Your father's wiser than he knows. He started walking toward the trail. Come on, we have work to do. As they descended the mountain, Sarah realized something that made her stop in her tracks. Mr. Ward, you said you caught the bear yesterday morning. I did, but you only came to town this morning. That's right. You were waiting again, weren't you? Waiting to see what we'd choose to do with it. Testing us. Elias glanced back at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something like approval in his eyes. The bear was never the real problem, Miss Garrett. Fear was. Prejudice was. Pride was. The bear was just the thing that made everyone have to face those problems directly. And now we see if this town is capable of learning, or if 7 years of mockery and dismissal will continue even after I've proven my value. They walked in silence for a while before Sarah spoke again. It'll be different now. People will respect you. Maybe, Elias said. Or maybe they'll resent me for making them admit they were wrong. Time will tell. But Sarah knew, with the certainty of someone who'd watched her father make the hard choice to embrace mercy over vengeance, that Pine Hollow had already changed. They just didn't all know it yet. The next 2 days in Pine Hollow moved with the purposeful energy of a community preparing for something significant. Sarah organized the supplies with meticulous care. Dried beef, hardtack, coffee, rope, canvas tarps, medical supplies in case of injury, tools for repairs, ammunition, and feed for the horses. She worked from a list Elias had provided, written in careful script that revealed an education most people hadn't suspected he possessed. Each item had a reason, each quantity calculated exactly. Nothing wasted. Nothing overlooked. You're putting together enough supplies for a military expedition, one customer remarked, watching her pack crates. It's a 6-day journey through wilderness, Sarah replied. They need to be prepared for anything. Word had spread through town about what was happening, about the trapped bear, about the decision to relocate it rather than kill it, about Elias Ward's strange mercy and the mayor's equally strange decision to support it. Opinions divided sharply. Some people thought it was wise, even noble. Others thought it was foolish sentiment that risked human lives for an animal. But everyone agreed on one thing. They'd misjudged the quiet mountain man who'd lived among them for 7 years. Buck Hendricks spent those 2 days organizing patrols, making sure the town remained protected while the mayor was gone. He did the work thoroughly, professionally, but his mood was dark. Martin Shaw tried to talk to him once, to ease the sting of wounded pride. You're a good hunter, Buck, Martin said, over whiskey at the saloon. Nobody's saying otherwise. They don't have to say it, Buck replied bitterly. It's written on every face. Buck Hendricks, the man who couldn't catch a bear. Buck Hendricks, who got shown up by a hermit. Elias Ward isn't a hermit. He's the grandson of Joseph Ward, Ghost Walker. That man was legendary among the mountain tribes. Best tracker who ever lived, they said. Elias learned from him. Well, nobody told me that. Did you ever ask? Martin said gently. Or did you just assume he was nobody because he didn't talk much? Buck had no answer to that. He drank his whiskey in silence, while Martin shook his head and walked away. Sarah visited Elias's cabin on the afternoon of the second day, ostensibly to confirm some details about the supplies, but really because she wanted to understand him better. She found him on his porch, working on a piece of wood with his carving tools. "What are you making?" she asked. He held it up. A bear, half-finished, its form emerging from the raw wood. "Something to remember this by. You carve beautifully. My grandfather taught me, said it helped you learn to see things clearly, to understand form and function." He set down the carving and the tools. "Did you need something, Miss Garrett?" "Just wanted to make sure we have everything right." She handed him the final list. "And to ask, are you sure about this? About taking the bear all that way?" "I'm sure about trying," Elias said. "Whether we succeed is up to the wilderness and the bear and a dozen other factors I can't control. But yes, I'm sure about making the attempt." Sarah sat on the porch step, uninvited, but not unwelcome. "You don't trust people much, do you?" "I trust them to be what they are. Sometimes that's good. Sometimes it's disappointing. Mostly it just is. That's a lonely way to live." "Lonely is relative, Miss Garrett. I've been alone for 7 years, but I haven't been unhappy. There's a difference." "Is there?" "I think you've been both." Elias studied her for a moment, and Sarah felt the weight of that pale blue gaze. "Your mother must have been an exceptional woman," he said finally, "to raise a daughter who sees things so clearly. She died when I was 12, but yes, she was. And your father raised you alone afterward. He did his best, made mistakes, same as anyone. But he taught me to think for myself, to question what everyone else accepts as truth. That's a dangerous gift to give a young woman in a small town." "Maybe," Sarah smiled. "But it's also freedom." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the afternoon light angle through the pine trees. Finally, Sarah stood to leave. "Mr. Ward, Elias, when you come back, things will be different. You know that, right?" "I suspect they will be. People will want to know you now, want your advice, your help. You won't be able to hide up here alone anymore." Elias picked up his carving again, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe I've been hiding long enough." The departure happened at dawn on the 3rd day. The whole town turned out to see them off. The mayor, Martin Shaw, Tom Johnson, and Elias Ward, along with 6 horses loaded with supplies and equipment. The travois was a work of engineering, 2 long poles attached to a horse's saddle, trailing behind with a platform built between them. On that platform sat the cage containing the bear, now modified with additional supports and padding to make the journey less traumatic for the animal. The bear watched everything with dark, intelligent eyes, still wary but somehow resigned to its fate. Samuel Garrett kissed his daughter goodbye, held her tight for a moment longer than usual. "Take care of the store," he said, "and take care of yourself." "You come back safe," she replied. "All of you." Buck stood at the edge of the crowd, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Just before they departed, he walked over to where Elias was checking the travois one final time. "Ward," Buck said, the name coming out stiffly. Elias turned, waiting. "I was wrong about you," Buck said, each word clearly costing him something. "I judged without knowing, and that was—" He stopped, started again. "That was ignorant of me. I'm sorry." Elias studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. "Apology accepted." Buck shook it, firm and brief, then stepped back. "Be careful out there. And bring the mare back in one piece, or his daughter will have both our hides. That's a promise I intend to keep." The expedition set out just as the sun broke over the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. They followed the trail north, moving slowly, carefully, mindful of their precious and dangerous cargo. The first day went smoothly. They covered 12 miles, staying on established trails, stopping frequently to check the cage and make sure the bear wasn't injured or overly stressed. The animal remained calm, conserving its energy, watching the changing landscape with what might have been curiosity. They camped that night in a clearing Elias had selected days earlier while planning the route. He'd done this entire journey in his mind before they ever started, mapping each day's travel, each night's campsite, each potential problem and its solution. Around the fire that evening, the men shared stories. Tom Johnson talked about his ranch, about the years of hard work building something from nothing. Martin Shaw told tales from his cavalry days, tracking hostile war parties across the plains. Samuel spoke about his late wife, about building the mercantile, about learning to be both father and mother to a headstrong daughter. Elias listened more than he talked, but when pressed, he shared a little about his grandfather, about learning to track and trap in these very mountains when he was just a boy. Ghost Walker, Martin said with reverence. I heard about him from the Shoshone. They said he could track a bird's shadow across stone. My grandfather would have laughed at that, Elias said. He was good, but he wasn't magic, just patient and observant. He used to tell me that most people look at the forest but don't see it. They look at tracks but don't read them. The difference between looking and seeing, that's where skill lives. You learned that lesson well, Samuel said. I had a good teacher and time to practice. 7 years of solitude teaches you things about patience that you can't learn any other way. The second day brought their first real challenge. The trail climbed steeply into higher elevations, and the travois had to be carefully guided through rocky sections where one mistake could send everything sliding down a slope. It took 4 hours to cover 3 miles, every man on foot, leading horses carefully, watching every step. The bear grew agitated as the altitude increased, its breathing heavier. Elias called a longer rest than planned, making sure the animal had water, speaking to it in that same soft, steady voice he'd used before. Easy, old one. We're taking you home. Just a little farther. Tom Johnson watched this interaction with something like wonder. You talk to it like it understands. Maybe it does in its way. Animals aren't stupid. They read tone, intention, emotion. That bear knows I'm not trying to hurt it. That matters. By evening of the second day, they'd covered only 8 miles total, less than planned, but Elias wasn't worried. We're not in a race, he said. We're in a journey. Those are different things. The third day brought rain, cold and steady, turning the trail to mud. They rigged a canvas cover over the cage to keep the bear dry and pressed on, miserable but determined. The going was slow, treacherous. Twice horses slipped. Once, the travois shifted dangerously on a switchback, and it took all 4 men working together to steady it. That night, huddled under tarps around a fire that struggled to stay lit in the damp, Samuel voiced what they were all thinking. This is harder than I expected. Most worthwhile things are, Martin replied, wringing water from his coat. Another 3 days of this, Tom said, not complaining, just acknowledging reality. Elias sat apart from the fire slightly, watching the bear in its cage. The animal was bedded down, its breathing steady, its eyes half closed. Despite everything, the journey, the stress, the confinement, it seemed at peace somehow. It knows, Elias said quietly. Somehow it knows we're trying to help. You think animals can sense that? Samuel asked. I think they sense more than we give them credit for. Intent, maybe, or just the absence of active hostility. Either way, that bear's not fighting anymore. It's waiting. That's trust in its way. The fourth day dawned clear and cold. They'd made it through the worst of the mountain passes and were descending into a broad valley that stretched north as far as the eye could see. The landscape changed, becoming lusher, more wild, more remote from any human settlement. Another 2 days, Elias said, studying the terrain. We'll reach the release site by evening tomorrow if we push hard, or the morning after if we take it slow. We take it slow, Samuel decided. We've come this far. We finish it right. They all agreed, and the journey continued. 4 men and 1 ancient bear, moving through wilderness toward something that felt increasingly like redemption. Dawn came soft and golden, the valley still wrapped in morning mist that clung to the rivers and pooled in the low places. The men rose quietly, moving with the careful purpose of people about to do something that couldn't be undone. They approached the cage slowly, rifles ready but held low, not to threaten, but as insurance against the unpredictable. The bear was awake, watching them with those dark, intelligent eyes that had seen so much in its long life. Elias moved to the front of the cage while the others positioned themselves at safe distances, ready to react if needed. He'd designed the release mechanism carefully, a rope and pulley system that would lift the door from 20 feet away, giving them distance and the bear a clear path to freedom. Everyone ready? Elias asked. 3 nods, 3 men with fingers near triggers but not on them, 3 sets of eyes locked on the massive animal that could kill any one of them in seconds if it chose. Elias took the rope in his hands, but before he pulled, he did something that made the others hold their breath. He walked up to the cage, close enough that the bear could have reached through the gaps with 1 massive paw. "Old one," he said softly, his voice carrying in the still morning air. "This is your home now. Far from humans, far from conflict. You've earned your peace. Take it." The bear huffed once, that same sound it had made before. Not quite a growl, not quite acknowledgement, but something in between. Elias stepped back, took up the rope, and pulled. The door lifted smoothly, rising up and out of the way. The path to freedom opened before the grizzly. Nothing between it and the wilderness except the choice to take it. For long seconds, the bear didn't move. It sat there, watching them, and time seemed to suspend in that moment of decision. Would it charge, seeing humans as the enemy that had caged it? Would it flee in panic? Would it understand what was being offered? Then, slowly, with the careful deliberation of age and injury, the bear rose to its feet. It moved to the opening, paused at the threshold, and looked back 1 final time. Elias met its gaze, and something passed between man and animal, not understanding in any human sense, but recognition. A shared moment of existence, of survival, of the complicated dance between humans and the wild things that both need and fear them. The bear turned and walked out of the cage. It moved past the men, not hurrying, not threatening, just moving with purpose toward the creek and the forest beyond. They watched it go, this magnificent creature that had terrorized a town and nearly died for the crime of trying to survive, now being given the rarest of gifts, another chance. At the edge of the clearing, the bear stopped and looked back 1 more time. Then it disappeared into the trees, its dark form swallowed by shadow and mist, and they heard the sounds of it moving away. Breaking branches, rustling undergrowth, the heavy tread of 800 pounds navigating through dense forest. The sounds faded. Silence returned to the clearing, except for the running water and the morning birds beginning their songs. Tom Johnson let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. It didn't charge. No, Martin agreed, his voice filled with wonder. It understood. Samuel lowered his rifle, his hands shaking slightly with released tension, and something else. Something like awe. I've never seen anything like that in my life. Elias stood motionless, still staring at the place where the bear had vanished. His weathered face showed emotion now, allowed it where before he'd kept everything carefully controlled. Relief, satisfaction, and something deeper. A sense of rightness that came from knowing he'd honored his grandfather's teachings, honored the old ways that valued life even when ending it would have been easier. We should mark this place, Martin said. So if others come through, they'll know this valley is claimed territory. Good idea, Elias agreed. He began gathering stones, flat ones that could be stacked. The others joined him, and together they built a cairn, a marker that would stand for years, a testament to what had happened here. When they finished, Elias pulled out his carving knife and marked symbols on the top stone, old signs that the mountain tribes had used to indicate sacred space, warnings that this was a place to be respected, not disturbed. What do those mean? Tom asked. They mean this is protected territory, Elias explained. Any tracker who knows the old ways will see these symbols and understand. This valley belongs to the bear now. We leave it in peace. Each man placed his hand on the cairn, a silent acknowledgement of what they'd witnessed, what they'd chosen, what they'd accomplished together. We should head back, Samuel said finally. We have a town to get to, and I suspect there are people waiting to hear how this turned out. They broke camp efficiently, loaded the horses, and began the long journey home. The cage that had held the bear was dismantled and left behind. They'd carry the travois poles but leave the rest, returning it to the wilderness from which it had come. As they climbed back up toward the mountain passes, Elias looked back one final time at the valley below. Somewhere down there, an old grizzly bear was beginning a new chapter in a long life, free from human conflict, free to live out its remaining time in the kind of peace that all creatures deserved. It was, he thought, a good day's work. The journey back took 4 days instead of 6. Without the bear to slow them, they could move faster, though they still traveled with care through the mountain passes. They arrived in Pine Hollow on a Thursday afternoon, dusty and tired, but carrying themselves with the quiet satisfaction of men who'd accomplished something worth doing. The whole town turned out to meet them. Sarah Garrett ran to her father first, embracing him with relief and joy that made Samuel's eyes water. Buck Hendricks stood near the front of the crowd, his expression cautiously hopeful. People called out questions. Did it work? Did the bear survive? Are you all safe? Samuel raised his hands for quiet, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the gathered crowd. The bear is free, he announced, released in a valley 60 miles north of here, far from any settlement. It walked out of that cage on its own power and disappeared into the wilderness. With any luck, it'll live out its remaining years in peace, and we'll never see it again. A murmur ran through the crowd. Relief, approval, some lingering skepticism, but mostly a sense of communal pride that they'd chosen mercy over vengeance. More importantly, Samuel continued, we learned something on that journey. We learned that the man we'd dismissed for 7 years, the man we'd called a hermit, and worse, is one of the finest trackers and wilderness experts any of us will ever meet. We learned that Elias Ward is the grandson of Joseph Ward, Ghost Walker, a legend among the mountain tribes and trappers alike. and we learned that we'd been damn fools for not asking him who he was before deciding we knew. Buck stepped forward then, and the crowd went quiet. He walked directly to Elias and extended his hand. "I was the biggest fool of all," Buck said, his voice carrying clearly. "I let pride blind me to skill, let my ego convince me I knew everything worth knowing about these mountains. Mr. Ward, you have my respect, my gratitude, and my apology. If you're willing, I'd like to learn from you." Elias shook his hand, firm and genuine. "I'd be honored to teach you, Buck. You're a good hunter. You just needed to understand that good hunters never stop learning." The crowd erupted in applause, and suddenly everyone wanted to shake Elias's hand, to thank him, to hear stories of the journey. For a man who'd spent 7 years in solitude, it was overwhelming, but also, perhaps, healing. That evening, Samuel called a formal town meeting at the church. The building filled again, but this time the mood was celebratory rather than fearful. "I have a proposal," Samuel announced from the pulpit. "Pine Hollow needs someone to manage our relationship with the wilderness, someone to advise us on wildlife issues, to track problem animals before they become crises, to teach our hunters and trappers proper methods. I propose we create an official position, Chief Wildlife Officer, and I propose Elias Ward be appointed to that role, with a salary paid from the town treasury." The vote was unanimous. Even those who'd been skeptical about the bear's release voted in favor. Elias had proven his worth beyond any doubt. A certificate was drawn up that night, hand-lettered by the schoolteacher on fine paper, signed by the mayor, and witnessed by the entire town council. It read, "Let it be known that Elias Ward is hereby appointed Chief Wildlife Officer of Pine Hollow, Montana Territory, in recognition of his unparalleled skill, wisdom, and service to this community." When it was presented to him, Elias held it carefully, his calloused fingers gentle on the paper. For a moment, he couldn't speak. "I'll accept," he said finally. "On one condition. I do it my way. I won't work on schedules or attend meetings unless necessary. I'll do the job that needs doing, in the manner that works best. Can you accept that?" Samuel smiled. "I wouldn't have it any other way." The weeks that followed brought changes to Pine Hollow and to Elias himself. His cabin was no longer a place of isolation. Townspeople came to him with questions about tracks they'd seen, about how to protect their livestock properly, about whether a particular area was safe for their children to play. He answered every question with patience, shared his knowledge freely, and slowly began to rebuild connections to human community that he'd thought were lost forever. Buck became a regular visitor, bringing his crew along to learn proper tracking techniques. Elias taught them to read sign, to move quietly through the forest, to understand animal behavior rather than just hunting it. The lessons transformed Buck from a boastful hunter into a genuine student of the wilderness, and his humility earned him more respect than his earlier pride ever had. Sarah Garrett visited most often, bringing supplies her father insisted on providing, staying to talk about books and ideas and life. A friendship developed between the mountain man and the mayor's daughter, one that the town watched with interest and approval, though both parties insisted it was just companionship. Young hunters came to learn from Elias, and he taught them not just technique but philosophy, respect for the animals, understanding of ecosystems, the responsibility that came with taking a life. He showed them his journals, encouraged them to keep their own, to document what they learned, so knowledge could be passed forward. One afternoon in late autumn, 6 months after the bear's release, Elias sat on his porch carving. The bear sculpture was long finished. He'd given it to Sarah, who displayed it prominently in the mercantile. Now he was working on something new. A wolf, mid-stride, captured in wood. Sarah rode up the trail, a basket of food tied to her saddle. "Father sent lunch," she called, "and I brought coffee." They sat together on the porch, eating bread and cheese, drinking strong coffee, watching the valley below where Pine Hollow spread out in the afternoon light. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked. "The 7 years of isolation? The time you spent alone?" Elias thought about it, really considered the question. "No," he said finally. "Those years taught me patience, taught me to be comfortable with myself. Maybe I needed them to be ready for this, for coming back to community without losing what I'd learned in solitude." "The town's better for having you," Sarah said. "We're better people now than we were before." "You were always good people. You just needed a reason to prove it." She smiled at that, and they sat in comfortable silence as the sun tracked west toward the mountains. Sometimes the people we underestimate hold exactly what we need, not just skill or knowledge, but the mirror we need to see our own blindness clearly. Elias Ward had been that mirror for Pine Hollow, and in reflecting their prejudices back to them, he'd given them the chance to become better. The old bear was out there somewhere, living its last years in peace. The town had learned to choose mercy over ease, and a lonely man had found his way back to belonging, not by changing who he was, but by finding people finally ready to see him clearly. In the end, everyone got their second chance. And that, Elias thought, carving another detail into the wooden wolf, was wisdom worth 7 years of waiting to find.